The photograph was tucked between brittle newspaper clippings and a receipt dated October 1921, its edges scalloped and soft with age. At first glance it looked almost charming. A family of four stood in front of a white wooden house, sunlight frozen across their faces, all of them smiling in that careful, practiced way people did back then, as if joy itself had to be held still for the camera. The father's hand rested proudly on the mother's shoulder. The mother leaned slightly toward the children. Everything about it suggested warmth, stability, a moment preserved exactly as intended. What struck me was how alive they looked. Photographs from that time usually carried a certain heaviness, a stiffness born from long exposure times and harder lives. But this one felt different. The smiles weren't strained, the children weren't solemn, even the shadows seemed gentle. I remember thinking, irrationally, that the family looked like they were waiting for someone just outside the frame, someone who had made them laugh seconds before the shutter clicked. I scanned the photo and enlarged it on my screen, more out of curiosity than purpose. The grain sharpened. Fine cracks appeared across the emulsion like veins. I zoomed in on the faces, then the background, noting small details. The curtains drawn just slightly, the grass trampled near the porch, the faint blur near the fence that might have been a bird or a trick of light. Then I noticed the child's hand. At first, my brain refused to register what my eyes were seeing. The youngest child stood in front, no more than 5 years old, smiling brightly, his arms held close to his body. But his left hand was wrong. The fingers were too many, or perhaps too long, curling at an angle that made my stomach tighten. It looked as though another hand was layered beneath it, darker, partially hidden, its grip firm and deliberate. I zoomed in further, my pulse beginning to thud in my ears. The hand was not blurred like the rest of the moving world. It was sharp, intentional, and it was not the child's. The discovery of the photograph happens almost by accident, which is what makes it so unsettling in hindsight. The narrator is not searching for anything ominous or significant, only sorting through a collection of old belongings that have lost their owners and their context over time. The photograph is found among items that suggest no importance at all, tucked away as if it were meant to be forgotten rather than preserved. This sense of randomness gives the moment an eerie authenticity, as though the image has chosen to be seen rather than deliberately uncovered. From the very beginning, the photograph feels out of place, not because it is disturbing, but because it appears too warm, too intact, too alive for something that has survived more than a century of neglect. What immediately stands out is the joy captured in the image. In an era known for solemn portraits and rigid expressions, the family's smiles feel almost modern, almost intimate. Their happiness does not look staged or forced by the limitations of early photography. Instead, it seems spontaneous, as if the photographer caught them in a rare moment of genuine comfort with one another. This subtle deviation from historical expectation plants the first seed of unease. The narrator senses that something is off, though nothing can yet be named or explained. The photograph seems to resist being categorized as merely old or sentimental. The longer the narrator studies the image, the more vivid it becomes. Small details begin to feel strangely intentional, as though every element in the frame has been carefully arranged. The closeness of the family members, the way their bodies lean toward one another, and the unnatural stillness of the background all contribute to the impression that this was not just a record of a family, but a moment suspended in time. The house behind them appears pristine, untouched by weather or age, reinforcing the illusion that the photograph exists outside of history rather than within it. Emotionally, the narrator experiences a quiet pull toward the image, a curiosity mixed with discomfort. There is a sense of intrusion, as though looking at the photograph for too long might awaken something that has remained dormant. Yet the joy on the family's faces acts as a kind of camouflage, discouraging suspicion and inviting prolonged attention. This contrast between surface-level warmth and underlying tension is crucial because it establishes the photograph as a deceptive object, one that disarms the viewer before revealing its Nature. By the time the narrator decides to examine the photograph more closely, the choice feels inevitable rather than deliberate. The image has already exerted its influence, drawing the observer in with its quiet charm. The discovery phase ends not with fear, but with fascination, setting the stage for the slow realization that the photograph is not simply a window into the past, but a doorway that should perhaps never have been opened. The moment the narrator zooms in on the photograph is casual and unguarded, driven more by idle curiosity than suspicion. At first, the digital magnification feels almost intrusive, as if the image is being violated by modern technology, pulled apart pixel by pixel in a way its creators could never have imagined. The grain of the photograph thickens, and imperfections emerge that were invisible at a distance. Scratches, dust, and chemical stains appear like scars, reinforcing the sense that time has not passed gently over this object. Still, nothing about these flaws suggests horror, only age, and the narrator continues without hesitation. Attention drifts naturally toward the child at the center of the image. Children in old photographs often feel unsettling on their own, caught between innocence and the long silence of history, and this one is no different. The child's smile is wide and unguarded, lacking the restraint seen in the adults. It is only when the narrator's eyes move downward that the unease begins to take shape. The child's left hand appears oddly positioned, resting too low against the body, fingers curled inward at an angle that feels uncomfortable to look at for too long. At first, the narrator assumes it is a trick of perspective or a distortion caused by the limitations of early photography. Zooming in further removes that comfort. The shape of the hand becomes clearer, and with clarity comes confusion. The fingers do not align as they should, overlapping in a way that suggests more than one hand occupying the same space. There is a thickness to the shadows between the fingers that cannot be explained by lighting alone. They appear deeper, heavier, as though something solid is blocking the light rather than simply absorbing it. The narrator feels a tightening in the chest, an instinctive physical response to something that defies normal explanation. The longer the narrator studies the hand, the harder it becomes to rationalize what is being seen. The texture of the skin does not match the rest of the child's body. It is darker, rougher, with a clarity that stands out unnaturally against the softer focus of the photograph. It looks too present, too intentional, as if it belongs to a different moment than the rest of the image. This realization creates a fracture in the narrator's perception, shifting the photograph from a historical curiosity into something more threatening. Doubt gives way to a growing sense of dread as the narrator considers the possibility that the hand does not belong to the child at all. It seems to be holding the child rather than resting there, its grip subtle but unmistakable. This single detail transforms the entire photograph, casting a shadow over the smiling faces and gentle setting. What once appeared joyful now feels staged, as though the happiness captured in the frame is not natural but enforced, maintained by an unseen presence that reveals itself only in this small, horrifying detail. As the narrator's unease deepens, the focus shifts from the shock of discovery to the need for confirmation. The mind resists accepting what the eyes insist on showing, and so the image is examined again and again, each time with growing intensity. The narrator adjusts contrast, sharpens edges, and isolates the area around the child's hand, hoping that a technical explanation will present itself. Yet with every adjustment, the disturbing detail becomes more defined rather than less. The hand's outline remains stubbornly clear, its presence refusing to dissolve into blur or artifact. Instead of fading under scrutiny, it asserts itself. What becomes most troubling is the realization that the hand does not align with any visible body in the photograph. Its angle suggests an arm extending from below or behind the child, yet no shoulder, sleeve, or shadow corresponds to it. The family members are positioned too far apart for the hand to belong to any of them, and the spacing between bodies makes such a connection anatomically impossible. This absence of origin gives the hand a detached quality, as though it exists independently of the people it touches. It feels less like a mistake in the image and more like an intrusion. The narrator begins to compare the hand to the child's other hand, noting subtle but undeniable differences. The size is wrong, slightly larger than it should be, with fingers that taper unevenly. The skin texture appears older, the knuckles more pronounced, the veins faintly visible despite the photograph's age. These are not the hands of a small child. They suggest strength rather than softness, control rather than innocence. The contrast between the child's cheerful expression and the possessive nature of the grip becomes increasingly unsettling. At this stage, the narrator considers whether the hand could belong to someone deliberately hidden, perhaps a prank or an accident of framing. But the more this possibility is entertained, the more it collapses under logic. Early photography required stillness, careful arrangement, and long exposure times. No one could have moved into the frame unnoticed. Nothing living could have entered and exited the shot without leaving traces elsewhere in the image. The hand's clarity implies that it was meant to be there from the moment the photograph was taken. This realization marks a crucial shift in perception. The photograph is no longer just a passive record of a moment in time. It begins to feel active, purposeful, as though it contains something that wanted to be seen but only partially revealed. The hand appears to exist at the boundary between presence and concealment, visible enough to be discovered, hidden enough to be ignored for decades. The narrator is left with the chilling understanding that the hand is not an anomaly created by the photograph, but a deliberate part of it, a silent participant in the family's frozen smile that has waited patiently for someone to finally notice it. The need to understand where the photograph came from becomes impossible to ignore, and the narrator turns to research with a sense of urgency that feels disproportionate to a single image. At first, the process is methodical and grounded in reason. Census records, property deeds, and local registries from the early 20th century are examined, all in the hope of anchoring the photograph to a verifiable history. The house in the background becomes a focal point, its architectural details compared against known structures from the era. Slowly, a location begins to emerge, a small town that once existed on the outskirts of a growing industrial region, now largely forgotten and absorbed into modern development. As names begin to surface, a family matching the photograph's composition appears in public records. The dates align, the number of children matches, even the father's occupation corresponds with subtle clues suggested by his clothing. At first, this discovery brings relief. The photograph belongs to real people, not an invention or anomaly. But that relief does not last long. The records abruptly thin out after a specific year. There are no death certificates where they should be, no marriage records for the children, no mention of relocation or immigration. It is as if the family stepped out of official existence without leaving a trace. The narrator expands the search to newspapers, expecting to find at least a brief mention of illness, accident, or financial ruin. Instead, what emerges is silence punctuated by implication. A short article references a property abandoned without explanation. Another mentions neighbors complaining of strange noises at night around the same address, though the article avoids specifics. There is no follow-up, no resolution. The town itself seems reluctant to remember what happened, its history smoothed over by time and disinterest. This absence of information proves more disturbing than any documented tragedy. The lack of closure suggests intentional omission rather than simple loss of records. It feels as though the story of the family has been deliberately erased, leaving behind only fragments that refuse to connect cleanly. The narrator begins to suspect that the photograph may be one of the few surviving pieces of evidence that the family ever existed at all, preserved not by chance, but because it serves a purpose. The timing of the photograph grows increasingly significant. Taken shortly before the family disappears from all records, it begins to resemble a marker rather than a memory. The smiles no longer feel like expressions of happiness, but like the final moment before something irreversible occurred. The narrator is left with the unsettling impression that whatever claimed the family did not do so violently or suddenly, but quietly, leaving behind no spectacle, no scandal, only an absence that echoes through the gaps in history and returns inexplicably in the form of a single photograph that refuses to let the past remain buried. The final realization does not arrive all at once, but settles slowly, like a weight pressing down on the narrator's thoughts. After days of research and repeated examinations of the photograph, a subtle shift occurs in how it is perceived. The image no longer feels like a fixed object, bound to a specific moment in 1921. Instead, it begins to feel porous, as though the past and present are bleeding into one another through its surface. The hand, once merely disturbing, now seems deliberate in a way that suggests intention beyond the frame. It was never meant to be noticed immediately, it was meant to wait. The narrator becomes acutely aware of how long the photograph went unexamined, passed from one owner to another without scrutiny. This delay starts to feel purposeful rather than accidental. The hand's partial concealment makes sense in this context. Fully hidden, it would have remained unknown. Fully visible, it might have been destroyed or dismissed. Its current state exists in a careful balance, visible only to those who look too closely, those who linger longer than they should. This understanding introduces the terrifying possibility that the photograph itself is selective in who it reveals its secret to. As this thought takes hold, the narrator begins to question their own role in the discovery. The act of noticing the hand feels less like chance and more like invitation. The photograph seems to reward attention, growing clearer and more oppressive the longer it is observed. The narrator feels watched, not by the smiling faces in the image, but by whatever presence the hand represents. It no longer seems confined to the child or the family, but aware of the observer, as though recognition has created a connection that cannot be undone. This connection extends beyond fear into a sense of responsibility. If the hand is evidence of something that once attached itself to the family, then the disappearance of the family may not have been an ending, but a transfer. The photograph, preserved and circulated, becomes a vessel carrying the presence forward through time. Each viewer who studies it too closely risks becoming the next point of contact. The narrator realizes that the true horror is not what happened in 1921, but what has been quietly continuing ever since. The photograph's endurance begins to feel unnatural. Paper should decay, ink should fade, and yet the image remains intact enough to be examined in unsettling detail. This resilience suggests preservation through means other than care or chance. The narrator is forced to confront the idea that the disturbing element in the photograph is not a relic of the past, but an active participant in the present, one that survives by being seen, acknowledged, one that does not remain trapped in history but reaches forward patiently through the gaze of anyone who dares to look closely enough.